Good day, folks. This is Greg Judy at Green Pastures Farm. Today, my guest is Mark Kennedy, and Mark is a fellow Missourian. Mark and I are up here at the Appalachian Grazing Conference in West Virginia at Morgantown. And Mark, would you tell us a little bit about your background and what you're all about?
Okay, I grew up on a diversified farm down in central Arkansas. We had a small dairy, milked 35 to 50 cows. We had about 80 head of beef cows, and we did catfish. So
you raise catfish?
We raised catfish.
How do you raise a catfish?
In pond, we had a lot of ponds for livestock water, and we made them serve dual purpose and raised and sold. Most of our business was selling dressed fish for fish fries and stuff. Occasionally we would sell fingerlings for people to restock their ponds. So,
okay. So how did you get the fish out of the ponds to dress them?
We had a seine.
Okay.
You know, it's like a big net, and kind of like with the cattle, if we were going to seine on Saturday where all the kids were there to help dress the catfish, we would go over Friday afternoon, lay the seine out in the edge of the water, get it wet so it'd sink down good. Saturday morning, go over there and throw the catfish feed out in that corner of the pond and drag the seine in behind them. Yep.
And so you were harvesting catfish that were like, what, 12 to 14 inches, or were they like 3 pounds?
They were like 3 pounds.
Okay.
That was kind of the ideal size in catfish for people eating. You get them too big and they're not quite as flavorful, and they may be a little tough, but that 3 pound catfish was kind of our ideal weight.
You get a fillet or something off that, that's a pretty good chunk of meat.
Yep.
Yeah. Well, we raised them one year and I enjoyed it. We had 300 of them in a cage.
Oh, yeah.
And fed them in that cage.
Yeah.
And I never got so sick of dressing fish in my life. We had to dress them all in one day. Yeah, 300 in one day. So,
yeah, we did that quite often.
I bet you're pretty good at
yeah, I was. I may have lost my touch, but I could skin a catfish pretty quick.
Well, let's progress to your grazing history. I met Mark years ago when I attended the research farm up at Linnaeus. Mark was one of the teachers there at the grazing school at the University of Missouri. And there was Jim Garish and Fred Martz and Ron Morrow, Kevin Moore, Morris Davis, yourself, and maybe in one or two I've forgotten. But a great group of you guys. And so Mark progressed down to today. What are you doing now?
After college, eventually I went to work for SCS at the time, what was the Natural Resources Conservation Service, or NRCS now, and I'd worked in some counties in North Arkansas, but my interest had always been in livestock and in pastures. That's kind of the way I grew up. And moved around as the government told me where my next check was going to be, and in most of those locations, as I mentioned in one of my talks here, I didn't want to live in town. Grew up out in the country and don't like houses when they get too close together, so I'd always buy some kind of farm. And as I said, being a low-paid government employee, I bought the farms that nobody else wanted, that were grown up in brush and weeds and whatnot, not much fencing on them. And I would get the fencing there, and then usually the first thing I'd put in would be goats to take some of that brush down. And as they opened it up a little bit, I might add a few sheep, and then cattle usually came in last. And I've done that on several farms, and then I'd either get transferred or somebody'd come along and say, offer me more than I thought it was worth, and sell it and buy something else and start all over. I kind of like that challenge, I guess.
Yep. I've seen some of your farms and your slides, and boy, you took some pretty rough old brushy areas, and with a pack of goats and your management, you've cleaned them up pretty darn nice.
Yeah. It's not overnight, as you say in some of your presentations, but I see seem like what I've saw in a lot of those. You get some gradual increases, some noticeable changes, but seem like about year 4, you get an explosion.
Doing things right.
Doing things right. 4 years of doing things, and it just all comes together, seem like that 3rd or 4th year. And you see a lot more advances.
Well, folks, I've known Mark for many years. I've been to a lot of conferences that Mark has spoken at, and we've spoken at the same conferences a few times. And every time I get a chance, this conference, I sat in on his talks, and it's always a pleasure to listen to Mark because he's so down to earth. Folks, when you go to a conference and somebody gets up there and they're actually doing it, or have been doing it, they just have more skin in the game. Wouldn't you say?
That's right.
Yeah.
And and in some cases, sometimes the agencies kind of frown on having too much going on the outside, but I always thought it helped me understand how you talk about building an electric fence if you've never built one yourself,
Yep.
or some of the problems you get into when you're trying to improve the pastures.
Right.
So
how do you manage goats?
Right.
You're doing it every day.
And especially when you get into the small ruminants,
Yep.
you've got to have a little bit of personal experience to understand what the person's talking about.
So Mark, walk us through your steps of getting a farm for the typical homesteader coming back to the land. He's got 20 to 40 acres of cedar trees and brush and broom sedge. What would be your recommendation? Where would he start at?
Get a good fence on there,
Okay.
a perimeter fence.
Yep.
Have a place to train the livestock to respect that electric fence, and with goats and sheep or cattle, the only thing I've used for the last probably 30 years or more has been electric fence.
Yep.
My perimeter was high tensile electric, and I liked 7-strand. It doesn't necessarily take that much to keep the sheep and the goats in, but that was part of my predator protection. And the 7-wire high tensile fence is still cheaper than a 5-strand barbed wire.
Mm-hmm.
So I would get that up, and it's alternating hot and ground. Some people, the last farm I had was only about 3 miles from the USDA office, and they would always send people down to look at my farm and the fencing, and a lot of people would call me later and say, we made a fence just like yours, but we made it better, and the goats are walking straight through it like it's not there. And as soon as they say they made it better, I know what they did. They made them all hot. Because in people's mind, them being all hot would be better. But in dry Ozark soils, when you get into a drought in the summertime in those gravelly soils, you're not getting good earth return ground.
Yep.
So you need that alternating hot and ground. The other time I found out in the wintertime, when we get those ice storms and you get about 2 inches of ice on the ground, you're not getting earth return ground.
They're not grounded.
The other thing on your predators, if they get airborne and all those are hot, they can get right through it without ever getting shocked.
Yep.
But if you've got your wire spacing right and one's hot and one's ground, you're going to turn them.
When they hit it, their feet aren't on the ground, but they're still going to be grounded.
Right.
Yeah.
Yep, they're going to be grounded. So that's the way I like to build the fence. And then on the interior, I put in some permanent interior cross fencing with high tensile, and then used a lot of poly wire. And I would break the goats when I got in the goat business. Once I got in Missouri, I'd run them once down in Arkansas too. But when I got in up here, I got some goats bought cheap, less than half the value, because somebody else couldn't keep them in, and they were being threatened with a lawsuit. So he let them go pretty cheap. And I train them. I have a training pen that is a physical barrier that they can't get out of, and I will line the inside of that with 1 strand of high tensile fence and put some aluminum foil on it that kind of flutters in the wind.
Yep.
And most animals, whether it be calves, goats, sheep, or whatever, are going to go up and either put a wet nose or a wet tongue on that piece of foil, and you get some abrupt bawling. And you can go back to the house, and if the house is close, you can listen for a while, and eventually you don't hear any more bawling. Everybody's decided not to get close to that wire. Then I went to phase 2, and I'd cross fence it with some poly wire.
Straight across the pen.
Yep. And I'd put the goats or the sheep, whatever I was training, on one side, and the feed and the water on the other side. And in that controlled environment, I was wanting them to try to run through that poly wire. And you kind of go through the same deal.
Yep.
You know, they bawl for a while, they're hitting the poly wire, and then eventually they quit trying to cross through the poly wire. And then I go out there and have to show them what a gate's going to look like in the pasture, so that they know there is going to be a safe mode of passage from one pasture to the other.
Yep.
And by the time I get them going back and forth through the gate, I can turn them loose.
And they're good to go.
They're good to go. And if and I always bring this out in grazing school. I've worked with producers with everything from geese to elephants, and I think you can train any class of livestock to respect electric fence.
Even a goose.
Even a goose. You got to have your wires a little closer together, or use some of the netting, but
Yeah.
There's going to be individual animals with any probably species or class that are simply untrainable. There's probably a few people that way. That's, as I say, that's why I was never in management. Those animals you got to get rid of.
Yep.
You got to get rid of the ones that don't respect what you're doing and are untrainable. And that's kind of the way I get started and get them used to the poly wire and use a lot of the portable fence. And I used a lot of the, I had some permanent waters, I had some spring developments. I had one off of a pipeline from my well, but I used a lot of the above ground pipe, quick connect couplers, and portable troughs.
Those are awesome, aren't they?
I mean, that just gives you so much flexibility in what you can do. You
Yep.
can make the poly wire run any direction and still have water in that strip you're giving them that day.
Yep. And when we start talking about quick connect couplers versus a hydrant, the cost.
Oh yeah.
Oh,
And I've worked with a lot of producers that had already installed in their underground pipeline the frost-free hydrants.
Yep.
And as they start to go bad, they're replacing them with the buried quick connect, even on the buried lines.
Yep.
They're putting the quick connect down in the heat well like you would your cutoff valve. And
Absolutely.
they're a lot less expensive, and I think less trouble.
yep. I don't think I've ever had the female portion of the quick coupler go bad, ever. Now the
I
males,
haven't.
you'll get a scratch on the side of them
Yeah.
and they'll leak a little bit.
Yeah.
But a male's $4.95.
Right. And the combination of the two, I even checked here at one of the vendors' booths. They had their catalog there because I was telling somebody else about them. They was asking, well, how much? I said, I know they're under $20, and they're still under $20.
That's crazy.
The male and female together. So
My hats are off to Plasson.
Yeah.
That's who we're talking about here, folks. It's called Plasson, Plasson. They're a quick coupler. They work like an air hose. When you
Yes.
plug in, you've
Yep.
got water.
You got water.
Yep. You unplug it, you don't have water.
You don't have water.
Yep.
Works
So-
great.
Well, Mark, now today you're still, you're kind of semi-retired, but you're still doing grazing schools
Yes.
all over Missouri and maybe the Midwest.
I go out of state some.
Some?
When I retired, actually January of 2014, so that means I've been retired 8 years now.
My goodness.
My wife says I haven't retired. I just changed the place where my check comes from. But NRCS was under staff reduction, or kind of some mandates to reduce staff. So at one time, Missouri had been fortunate. We had two state grazing land specialists, one that covered the north half of the state. As you mentioned, Morris Davis had been one of my counterparts.
Yep.
And I covered the south half down there in the rough Ozark Hills.
Okay.
And when I retired, they were back down to the one that was going to be spending most of their time in Columbia in the office and couldn't get out and do all the stuff we've been doing. So NRCS actually contracted with the Missouri Forage and Grassland Council to provide grazing school teachers, and me and another retired employee. Then MFGC contracted with us. So a lot of what I do throughout the year, especially April through October, is grazing schools all over the state. I do some private consulting with producers as I can fit it into that schedule, because since I'm already contracted with the other one, I've got to hit those grazing schools. But as time permits, I can work with some individual producers.
You bet. Well, folks, Mark is a wealth of knowledge. I feel fortunate to have rubbed shoulders with this, I would say, giant in the grazing industry in the state of Missouri. And it's always a pleasure, Mark, when I get to bump into you, and I enjoy sitting in on your talks this conference. And so with that, again, thank you.
Thank you, Greg.
For your
and
time.
I enjoy visiting with you. I've learned a lot from you over the years.
Well, I feel awful humble that coming from you, but I sure look up to you, and it's been a pleasure. And I probably wouldn't be here talking to you if it wasn't for you, because I learned a lot from you, Mark, when I was starting out. I really did, and so thank you for that.
Thank you.
And folks, on the way out, hit that subscribe button, and we'll see y'all next time down the road.